Hi friends, this is the second lecture in our unit on special senses. So topic 2, we are going to be looking at hearing and proprioception. So we're starting with hearing. The anatomical terminology for hearing is audition or auditory information. And as you might already know, the structures involved in hearing are all pretty specifically located in and around the ear. So if we are looking at the anatomy of the ear from the outside of the head, working our way internally, you will see the outer ear is made up of this big kind of seashell shaped structure. And depending on whether you're dealing in Greek or in Latin, you would call this the pinna or the auricle. The purpose of the outer ear is to funnel sound waves from the external environment into, obviously, structures where they can be received and processed as sound. So if we imagine sound coming into the outer ear, then the next structure is called the external acoustic meatus, or the EAM. In kind of standard English, we call that the ear canal. And it ends at the first structure of the middle ear, which is called the tympanic membrane. So tympany is a type of drum. The tympanic membrane is also known in standard English as the eardrum. You can see as the external acoustic meatus moves from the outer ear toward the middle ear, we are going through the skin of the head, and then the ear canal ends within the temporal bone of the skull. So into the middle ear, so in this picture, we're dealing in the kind of middle third of this graphic, and we're looking at the three little yellow bones inside the head. So the middle ear has three what are called auditory ossicles. These are the tiniest bones in the body. So the first is called the malleus. That's Latin for hammer because it's shaped sort of like a hammer. The second bone is called the incus, which is Latin for an anvil. And the third bone is called the stapes, which is Latin for stirrup. You can see it here. It looks like a little horseshoe, kind of upside down. So when sound waves come into the ear canal, they vibrate the tympanic membrane. As that membrane vibrates, it causes the malleus to then hammer into the middle incus, and then the incus to hammer into the stapes. And eventually the stapes concentrates those vibrations and delivers them to a tiny structure called the oval window, which is at the inner ear. The inner ear, you can see we have quite a few kind of structures here in yellow. We're going to talk more about those in just a moment. But I want to direct your attention to this dark red hollow space where the ossicles are housed, and this tube that goes down and to the right in this graphic. So that hollow space is called the eustachian tube, and it is an air-filled space. It connects at this bottom end. Eventually it connects to the back of the throat. And so as we breathe and as we eat and as we talk, there's air constantly flowing in and out of our mouths and in and out of this eustachian tube, and it helps to kind of maintain air pressure within the skull. When there is, say, congestion, maybe in our throats or nose or sinuses, the eustachian tube can get kind of filled up with mucus and other things, and that can put pressure on the tympanic membrane from inside the head, and we feel that as a pressure in our ears. So when you have a really bad cold or a sinus infection, you might feel the need to kind of pop your ears all the time. That's because of the pressure of the extra mucus and things in your skull pushing against that tympanic membrane. We also feel the shifting of the tympanic membrane when you are in environments where the outside air pressure or the outside water pressure, say if you're scuba diving, for example, is different than standard air pressure. Any pressure inside or outside the head is going to push that membrane in or out. And we can feel that as a little bit of discomfort in our inner ear. So to get to the final few structures of the inner ear, here we're looking at the yellow structures on the far right of this picture. There is what's called the labyrinth, which you can't really see especially well in this picture. And then there are the 3 semicircular canals, which are 3 little kind of clover leaf shaped structures up toward the top of the inner ear. And then we have a large seashell shaped structure. It looks sort of like a cinnamon roll, called the cochlea. So the cochlea and the labyrinth are both involved in the process of hearing. The semicircular canals are not in any way involved in hearing, and we'll talk about what they do in just a moment. So the cochlea is a super important structure for hearing because that is where the mechanoreceptors that determine your sense of sound are located. So growing out from the walls of the cochlea are tiny little hair cells, just like you have in your nasal cavity. Those hair cells have mechanoreceptors inside, and the cochlea is filled with a viscous fluid. So as sound waves are concentrated by first the eardrum, then the auditory ossicles, and then the oval window, they get transported to the cochlea, and they are vibrations that cause the fluid inside the cochlea to shift. And when that fluid shifts, the hairs bend back and forth. Think about sort of like tall grass in a lake or a swamp. When it's really windy or the waves are really strong, then that grass will bend back and forth. As those hair cells bend, that creates action potentials. Those action potentials then travel to the very inside part of the cochlea, and they get transferred to the cochlear or auditory nerve. Both terms are used interchangeably. And those action potentials are then passed to the auditory cortex within the temporal lobe, and that's where sound is interpreted. This picture shows you kind of the process on both sides of the head and then the transfer of that information to the temporal lobes. So your brain has to do a little bit of work whenever you hear. So for example, right now you're hearing my voice. If you're sitting directly in front of your computer or your phone or whatever, the 2 ears are receiving the information at essentially the same time because the speaker is right in front of you. A lot of times, though, information is received from one side of the head or the other. Maybe somebody yells your name from down the hall. And so the brain has to take the timing that each ear received the information, as well as the intensity of those sound waves. Were the waves really strong or were the waves really weak? And that helps the brain to then determine from where the sound originated and the degree of volume and pitch and whatnot that the sound itself was making. So we always talk about if things are working the way they're supposed to and what happens when they're not. So there are a few different ways that humans can suffer hearing loss. The most common way is just through overuse. So as the hair cells in the cochlea are bending back and forth, very, very high volume stimulation will cause those hair cells to bend back and forth really quickly. And if they overbend, they can actually snap off. Once those hair cells snap and break, they die. They are not repaired. Like most nervous cells of the body, they don't regenerate. So repeated exposure to very loud music, for example, can cause permanent hearing loss at a very young age. Some of the more structural reasons why you might suffer hearing loss is people can be born or experience a cochlear injury, where the cochlea itself is harmed in some way. It could be an infection, it could be physical trauma, it could be that it just didn't develop in utero properly. If the cochlea is damaged, then there's no receptors for sound to be collected, and so the person would experience what we know of as deafness. There is also there are cases where the auditory nerve itself can be damaged. So even though the ear and all of its structures are working well, there's no pathway to get that information from the ear to the brain. Okay, So I told you we would talk about the semicircular canals in the inner ear in just a moment, and that moment has arrived. So our second special sense today is called proprioception, which is probably a sense you have never heard of. So proprioception is defined as the ability to determine where we are in space and how our body is positioned. So proprioception is how your body can tell, even if you close your eyes, your body can tell if you're sitting up or if you're laying down. It can tell if you're standing on one foot or if you're standing on two, all kinds of information. So there are sort of two equilibrium factors involved in proprioception. The first one is static equilibrium. And so static equilibrium gives us information about the position of our head specifically, and then information about your own posture and balance when the body is at rest. So if you are laying down, for example, your static equilibrium is at play there because you're not physically moving and your posture is essentially stationary. Dynamic equilibrium is how your body determines your position and direction and action while you are actually in motion. And the way that it does this is very similar actually to the way that the hair cells in the cochlea determine sound. There, again, within the semicircular canals, there's fluid. And growing out from the walls of the semicircular canals are hair cells. You see a little picture of this on the lower right. Those hair cells shift position when the fluid within the semicircular canals shifts position. That positional change causes action potentials. Those action potentials then travel down a nerve called the vestibular nerve, and that information goes to their cerebellum to provide posture and movement info. So the semicircular canals you can see are in these three little loops. One is on the vertical axis, one is on the horizontal axis, and one is on a 45-degree angle axis. And so they pretty much cover all the possible angles at which your body could be positioned at any given time. Much like hearing loss, there are potential problems with our sense of proprioception. The most common one is motion sickness. So your brain requires a lot of information to make a complete picture of the world, and it usually uses multiple senses to get that information. So with motion sickness and other proprioceptive issues, it's usually a case of the different sensory information coming into the brain are conflicting. So for example, when you are riding in the backseat of your car, your body is sitting still, right? You're stationary. So your your static equilibrium is telling the brain you are at rest, you are not moving. But your eyes see trees flashing past, cars flashing past, lights moving by, which tells us you're in motion. Your ears hear cars driving past you and other information. And so your brain gets confused. Some of the senses are saying you're sitting still. Some of the senses are saying you're in motion. And when the brain gets confused, one of its very first go-to responses is nausea. So that's where motion sickness comes from. There are some other more extreme versions of proprioceptive issues like vertigo, but motion sickness is one that most people have experienced. So here are your summary questions for this set of notes. We will also take a few minutes in class. If you have any questions, as always, write them down and we will chat next time I see you. Thanks very much.